to get us started, what is a pulse survey?
Well, a pulse survey is essentially a very short and frequent survey that is sent out to customers or employees to get a quick pulse check on their sentiment or feedback.
It's kind of like taking a temperature.
Exactly. It's a very quick snapshot in time versus those traditional longer surveys that we might be used to that go very in depth. And by the time they're analyzed, the data might already be outdated.
Okay, so it's not about getting rid of those longer surveys altogether. It's about adding in these pulse surveys to get a more kind of constant feedback loop.
Exactly.
Gotcha. And the article really focuses on how valuable this is for B2B companies, especially why is that?
Well, because in the B2B world, relationships are everything. It's all about building that long-term trust and providing value consistently.
Sure.
So pulse surveys allow businesses to really keep their finger on the pulse, so to speak, of those relationships. You can track things like customer satisfaction, see if their needs are changing, and make sure that you're continuing to meet or even exceed their expectations.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the article goes into 5 main uses for pulse surveys, and the first one is monitoring customer satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of waiting for like an annual survey, you're getting that feedback in real time. So what kind of an impact can that have?
Well, think of a SaaS company that's constantly releasing new features. They could use a pulse survey to gauge customer reactions to those features immediately so they know, are there any usability issues? Are there any improvements they could make?
Right.
And that could mean the difference between a successful launch and one that maybe falls flat.
So you're not just collecting data, you're actually using it to proactively improve the product and the customer experience.
Exactly.
Which ultimately leads to higher satisfaction.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. What about tracking changes in customer needs? It feels like those needs are always changing, especially in the B2B world.
Absolutely. They are. So let's say you're a manufacturing firm that's been supplying a certain component to clients for years, and suddenly the market changes and there's a demand for a more sustainable alternative.
Okay.
Well, if you're not using pulse surveys to stay in tune with those evolving needs, you risk losing those customers to a competitor who is.
So it's all about staying ahead of the curve and anticipating those needs before they even become a problem. Okay, now launching new initiatives, that's always a little bit of a gamble, right?
Mm.
How can pulse surveys kind of de-risk that process?
Well, imagine you're a marketing agency and you're rolling out a brand new service package.
Okay.
Well, instead of just launching it and hoping for the best, you can use pulse surveys to get feedback from a select group of clients during a pilot phase.
Ah, I see.
That way you can make adjustments based on real customer input, which dramatically increases the likelihood of a successful launch.
So it's almost like having a built-in focus group that's giving you constant feedback.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
Much better than just, launch it and pray.
Exactly.
And this kind of ties into the idea of proactive engagement, right? So instead of waiting for complaints to come in, you're actively reaching out to your customers.
Yeah, it's about fostering that two-way dialogue and showing your customers that you actually care about what they have to say.
Right.
So it could be as simple as sending out a quarterly pulse survey asking what's one thing we could do to improve your experience.
And that one question can give you so much information.
Oh, absolutely. Tons of insights.
Okay. And then the last use case that the article talks about is evaluating long-term customer loyalty. And we all know customer retention is so important, especially in B2B. So how can pulse surveys help with that?
Well, think of a consulting firm that relies on those long-term contracts. They can implement an annual NPS survey, which stands for Net Promoter Score, to gauge customer loyalty. And if they see a dip in scores, they can proactively address whatever issues might be causing that before it leads to a lost client, which could potentially save them millions of dollars in lost revenue.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
So pulse surveys, they're not just a feedback tool. They're really like a strategic asset that can have a huge impact on your bottom line.
Definitely.
I'm starting to get why they're such a big deal. Okay. So the article goes on to talk about different types of pulse surveys. And this is where it gets really interesting because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, right?
Oh, you got it. There's a whole toolbox full of different pulse surveys, each designed to measure a different aspect of the customer experience.
So let's break down those different types you mentioned earlier. Pulse surveys are like a temperature check on customer health. One way to get that reading is with a customer satisfaction score or a CSAT survey.
That's right. So CSAT surveys are focused on immediate satisfaction after a specific interaction. So, for example, let's say a customer just finished a support call.
Right.
You might send them a CSAT survey that simply asks, how satisfied were you with the service you received today?
Oh.
So you get that instant feedback on whether or not that interaction actually met their needs.
Simple to the point, gives you valuable data.
Exactly.
Love it. Okay. Now, I've definitely heard of Net Promoter Score or NPS surveys. Those seem to be everywhere these days. What makes them so popular?
Well, NTS surveys are all about understanding customer loyalty and their likelihood to recommend your business to others.
Okay.
So they usually involve asking that classic question on a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this company to a friend or colleague?
Right. And then those responses get segmented into promoters, passives, and detractors. And that segmentation is really key, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It lets you pinpoint who your biggest fans are, who's kind of on the fence, and who might be at risk of leaving, so you can then tailor your strategies to nurture those relationships accordingly.
So you're not just getting a number, you're getting actionable insights into your customer base.
Absolutely.
Okay. On to customer effort score or CES surveys.
Yeah.
You seem to be all about making things easier for your customers.
Exactly. CES surveys measure how much effort a customer had to expend to complete a specific task. So think like resolving an issue or making a purchase.
Okay.
So they often use a scale asking something like, how easy was it to complete this task? And generally speaking, the lower the effort, the higher the satisfaction.
That makes sense. I
Okay.
mean, you want things to be as frictionless as possible for your customer, right?
For sure. The easier, the better.
Are there any other types of pulse surveys we should know about?
Yeah, there are a couple more. So there are customer engagement pulse surveys, which are a bit broader in scope, and they look at the overall engagement level with your brand, your products, your services.
Gotcha.
So these can be really helpful for identifying any early warning signs of churn. So those subtle shifts in customer behavior that might indicate a need for intervention.
So it's like taking the temperature of the relationship as a whole rather than focusing on one specific interaction.
Exactly.
Okay. And then there are product feedback pulse surveys, which seem pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah. These are all about capturing that early feedback on new products or features. You know, you might send one out to beta testers or early adopters and just ask for their initial impressions and suggestions. And that feedback can be incredibly valuable for shaping the product roadmap and making sure that you're building something that customers actually want and need.
Okay. So we've got CS, NPS, CES, customer engagement, and product feedback pulse surveys. That's quite the arsenal, but I'm curious, are there any real-world examples of how these are being used by B2B companies? Is this something that we can picture and apply to our own situations?
Oh, absolutely. The article highlights some really great examples. So let's dive into those next. Let's start with onboarding. You know, when you bring on new customers, picture a software company that's just revamped their entire onboarding process.
Right.
They could send out a pulse survey maybe 2 weeks in and just ask, you know, how would you rate the clarity of our onboarding materials?
Right.
And that could really help them pinpoint any areas of confusion early on. You know, maybe they need clearer tutorials or a more intuitive user interface. It's about turning that feedback into action.
It's like catching those little thumbles before they turn into like major roadblocks for the customer.
Exactly.
That's smart. The article also mentioned using NPS surveys for loyalty tracking. What would that look like in practice?
Well, imagine a manufacturing firm that sends out a quarterly NPS pulse survey to their key accounts. And let's say they notice a dip in scores from a particular segment of those clients. Well, they can dig deeper and try to understand what's driving that dissatisfaction.
How would they dig deeper?
Well, they could use targeted follow-up questions or even just reach out directly and have a conversation. You know, it could be anything from delivery delays to maybe a competitor offering a more enticing solution.
So it's not just about the score itself, it's about what you do with that information.
That's the key.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, what about CES surveys? Any examples of how those are being used effectively?
Think about a tech support provider. You know, they could use CES surveys after every single support ticket is resolved.
Okay.
A simple question like, how easy was it to get your issue resolved today, can reveal a lot. You know, if they're consistently seeing low scores, it might indicate a need to revamp their knowledge base or streamline their ticketing process.
So it's all about removing those points of friction in the customer journey.
Exactly. Make it smooth, make it easy.
The smoother the experience, the happier the customer.
Pretty much.
Okay. The article also talks about customer engagement pulse surveys. Those seem particularly useful for businesses that have like ongoing relationships with their clients.
They are. So let's say you're a marketing agency and you're managing social media for a client.
Okay.
You could send a quarterly pulse survey asking how satisfied are you with our communication and responsiveness over the past 3 months. You know, that gives you a sense of how engaged they are. Do they feel heard and valued?
Yeah.
It could reveal opportunities to improve collaboration or maybe provide more tailored reporting.
So it's a relationship check-in. Make sure everyone's on the same page. The lines of communication are open.
Exactly.
What about product feedback pulse surveys? I can see how those would be crucial for companies that are, constantly innovating and coming out with new things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So imagine a B2B software company that's just launched a beta version of their new project management tool. They could send out a pulse survey to their beta testers, just asking, what are your initial impressions of the new task management feature?
Right.
That allows them to gather feedback on very specific aspects of the product, and they can use that feedback to refine and improve it before they release it to the wider market.
It's like having a direct line to your target users.
Yeah.
And being able to incorporate their feedback right into the development process.
It's so valuable.
That's invaluable.
Okay.
Okay, these examples really paint a clear picture of how versatile and impactful pulse surveys can be. But let's get real for a second. We all know how frustrating it is to send out a survey and get a dismal response rate.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Are there any tips for designing pulse surveys that people will actually want to complete?
That's a great question. And thankfully, the article offers some solid advice on how to boost those response rates.
Let's hear it. I'm all ears. I think we all are.
All right. Well, first and foremost, brevity is key. Nobody wants to wade through a novel-length survey.
Right.
So keep your pulse survey short, to the point, focus on just a few key questions.
You want to capture their attention while you have it.
Exactly.
Not make them feel like they're doing homework.
Exactly.
What else?
Well, it's equally important to actually show that you're listening to the feedback that you're getting so close. The loop acknowledge responses and let people know how their input is being used.
So it's not just about collecting data. It's about demonstrating that you value their opinions and that you're taking action based on what they've shared.
Precisely. And that makes people much more likely to participate in future surveys.
It builds trust, right?
It does.
The article also highlights the power of automation.
Yes.
Set up those automated reminders and distributions so you're not constantly chasing people down.
It just takes the hassle out of the process.
Automation is always a good thing.
It really is.
Anything else we could do to make those surveys more appealing?
Personalization can go a long way. So if possible, tailor your questions to specific customer segments or even individual needs.
It shows that you're paying attention and you're not just sending out like these generic mass-produced surveys.
Right. It makes the feedback feel more relevant and valuable to the individual.
Okay, so we've got brevity, closing the loop, automation and personalization, all great tips. But before we wrap up this section, there's one thing I'm still curious about. The article mentions microsurveys. And I'm wondering how those fit into the picture. Are they the same thing as pulse surveys?
That's a common question. And while they are related, there is a subtle but important distinction. So think of microsurveys as like the building blocks of a pulse survey.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So microsurveys are those really short, focused questions, often just one or two that you might see embedded in a website or an app.
Okay.
And they're designed to capture feedback at a very specific moment in the customer journey.
So like, did you find what you were looking for today? After like a website search.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, a pulse survey might include several microsurveys deployed at different points in time to give you a broader picture of the customer experience over time.
So it's not so much about the length of the survey, it's more about the frequency and the strategic intent behind it.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But, we've talked a lot about the what and the how of pulse surveys. But I think it's important to also talk about the why should our listeners care about all of this?
Well, I think at its core, it's about building better relationships.
Okay.
Whether it's with your customers or your team or even in your personal life.
Right.
It's about fostering open communication, actively seeking feedback, and showing the people around you that their opinions actually matter.
I love that it's not just about gathering data. It's about creating this culture of continuous improvement and building stronger connections. I mentioned that anecdote at the beginning about how I sometimes feel like my feedback on those long surveys is just falling into a black hole.
Yeah.
Well, pulse surveys are the antidote to that. They're about closing the loop, demonstrating that you're listening, and taking action based on what you hear.
And that can be so powerful. It builds trust, it encourages collaboration, and it creates this sense of shared ownership. When people feel like their voices are being heard, they're more likely to be engaged and invested and ultimately more loyal.
So it's not just good for business. It's good for any relationship where feedback is valued.
Absolutely.
That's a pretty compelling argument for incorporating pulse surveys into our lives. Okay, as we wrap up, let's distill this down to some key takeaways for our listeners. First and foremost, pulse surveys are those short, frequent check-ins designed to capture sentiment in real time.
Like a quick pulse check on the health of a relationship?
Exactly. Second, they have a wide range of uses from monitoring satisfaction to tracking needs, testing initiatives, engaging proactively, and evaluating loyalty.
Third, there's a whole toolbox of different types of pulse surveys, each with its own strengths and purposes.
Right. We've got CSAT, NPS, CES, customer engagement, and product feedback surveys, just to name a few.
And fourth, to make sure your pulse surveys are hitting the mark. Keep them short, act on the feedback you receive, automate the process, and personalize them whenever possible.
Excellent advice. But before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with a little challenge. Don't just think about how you could use pulse surveys. Actually try it.
Yeah, pick one area of your work or life where you'd like to improve communication or gather feedback. Maybe it's your team at work, a client relationship, or even your family.
Design a short, focused pulse survey, maybe just 1 or 2 questions, and send it out. See what you learn.
You might be surprised by the insights you gain.
Exactly. And remember, the most important part is what you do with that feedback. Close the loop, take action, and show the people around you that you truly value their input.